In The Wire, we follow a number of different gangsters and drug dealers operating in Baltimore, Maryland. One of these men is Eastside Proposition Joe, a drug kingpin who's been in the game for years, building a respectable reputation for himself. A co-founder of the New Day Co-op, an alliance between rival drug dealers for them to come to non-violent solutions to their differences, Joe is cunning, business-orientated, and he supplies much of Baltimore's heroin through his connection to the elusive Greeks. Joe's big personality, charisma, and preference for peaceful solutions over violence makes him a likable character in and amongst the numerous street characters of The Wire, and his death at the hands of Marlowe in Season 5 is all the more painful given he treated Marlowe like a son, civilizing him, mentoring him, and showing him how to make money while staying off the cops' radar. Joe took one for the team, in a sense, attempting to bring the violent and unstable Marlowe onto the side of the co-op, and he did this by showing him the ropes and making things easier for him, so things would be easier for the co-op. Marlowe, though, only saw Joe as just a part of the ladder he needed to climb to get to the top and crown himself the king of the streets, and once he got the connection with the Greeks, he had no reason to keep Joe around and had him killed. Why the cautious Greeks would choose someone like Marlowe over Joe is something I've already discussed in another video, so check it out and subscribe to the channel for more videos on The Wire. What I'm concerned with today is Melvin Wagstaff, aka Cheese, the burdensome nephew of Joe. Cheese works for Prop Joe, and he has his moments here and there throughout The Wire, like when he torches Ziggy's car in Season 2, or when he gets interrogated by the cops who think he's in on a murder when actually his dog died. Cheese is actually a pretty funny character, I think. He has some great lines where he mixes eloquence with street slang, like saying shit was unseemly or some shameless shit. No doubt he picked up some words from his uncle. If only he picked up his ethics and family values from his uncle too, as what Cheese is most famous for is selling out Proposition Joe, his own uncle, to Marlowe, and then working for Marlowe. It's something that made fans of The Wire universally hate Cheese, and one of the most satisfying moments of the show is when Slim Charles puts a bullet in Cheese's head for Joe. So why did Cheese betray his uncle? He had it good. He was in Joe's inner circle and rising in prominence under his uncle's wing. Of course, there doesn't have to be a specific reason. This is an unforgiving world these characters live in, where people are being betrayed all the time. But just like Carlo's betrayal of Tony in The Sopranos, which I've detailed in a separate video, I think there are subtle details and clues that paint a bigger picture. Ostensibly, Cheese is a weasel, a snake. He is just an arsehole. And Marlowe would have paid him good money to get the drop on Joe, not to mention Cheese would have inherited much of what Joe had in terms of money and property. And really, you could close the argument here. He betrayed Joe because he's not a very nice guy, and he's in it for himself. He even has a son in the show who he never acknowledges. Check out my video on Randy Wagstaff for more details. And he sold out Joe for his own greed, power, and blind ambition. You could make the argument that Joe himself was pretty snake-like. However, Joe had his qualities. He was loyal to his family and his neighborhood. He was a born hustler who knew where he came from and had, for example, reverence for his grandfather, who was the first black man to own a house in Jackson Square. As he says, that means something. Cheese has none of these qualities. Joe feels like the kind of drug dealer that started the game, who perhaps went into that kind of life because the doors were closed in the legitimate world, full of racism and systemic discrimination. He was a dealer, a killer, but he had a code. He held on to his old school values and built things that actually benefited, like the New Day Co-op. Cheese, on the other hand, benefits no one but himself, and thus it's easy to see why he is hated for selling out Joe, especially seeing as though, ironically, Joe protected Cheese from Marlowe when Omar robbed the stash. Plus, it's one thing to play the game and get ahead, it's another to betray your family. Cheese would be dead without his uncle's protection. Like Ziggy, whose car he burned, he is immature, spoiled, and would be nowhere without his uncle. Marlowe would have promised him a higher position under him, and given Cheese's short-sightedness, he accepted, not realizing that if Joe died soon, he might be next in line to replace Joe as a kingpin of the Eastside, instead of being just another one of Marlowe's goons. Interestingly, Cheese going over to Marlowe's side is actually foreshadowed in the scene where he meets Marlowe's crew, comments on their coldness, and then says, "Where do Cheese sign up?" Anyway, on to these subtle details. The Wire hints to us that, as well as all the obvious reasons for betraying Joe, money and power, Cheese was becoming increasingly unsatisfied with Joe's leadership, a la Carlo and Tony, and he saw him as being weak in a world where the game had gotten a lot more fierce. An early example is Joe taking Nick's side when Cheese burns Ziggy's car, or at least that's how Cheese would have seen the issue. But he even had a gun pulled on him by Boris, highly embarrassing, and rather than being allowed to take revenge, Prop Joe is instead hugging the man who threatened Cheese. Joe obviously knows Sergei's connection to the Greeks. There are bigger things at play here, the heroin supply, the good dope, but Cheese wouldn't know or care about any of that, which is the main issue with him, his lack of vision. All he would have seen is Proposition Joe undermining him and favouring enemies. Ziggy failed to return the value on the drugs that Cheese gave him, and yet Cheese has to pay for his burnt car. Oh, the humanity! That's all he would have seen, not that it's the East Side's best interest to keep people like Boris happy. He would just be embarrassed and feel that his street reputation took a hit. Cheese also gets shot by Brother Mozone in Season 2, who's working for Avon, and again, he isn't allowed to retaliate. Not that he would have been able to do anything much, because of course Prop Joe is working on bigger and better things, establishing the co-op with Westside and Stringer Bell. This is something that will be better for Eastside in the long run, but Cheese doesn't have the foresight of Joe. Then there's the part where Omar robs Prop Joe's stash. We should note that Cheese was there and yet takes no responsibility, but in any case, in his bravado he tells Joe they should go out looking for Omar with all guns blazing. Again, instead of killing Omar and losing the stash, Joe plays it clever by buying the drugs back from Omar for 20 on the dollar, and then selling it to the co-op for 30 on the dollar. So even though his drugs were robbed, he came out okay and played the co-op. Cheese, however, like many young people so ready to flex and prove themselves, would see Joe as going soft for not killing Omar. He would see him as not adjusting to the new ways, instead respecting Marlowe's methods of simply killing everyone you don't like, and recognizing his ambition to be the man at the top, and probably figured he'd want to be in on that and leave the sinking ship that was Joe. When Omar has Joe at gunpoint and wants him to set Marlowe up, Joe tells Omar that Cheese is his sister's boy. Giving out private information like that would have pissed off Cheese, but if he was clever, he would have seen that some kind of intimate information was necessary to give in this instance so that Omar would trust them. And given the scene ends with Joe shaken and wanting to avoid being tangled in a war between Omar and Marlowe, Cheese, again, would have been frustrated with Joe's lack of action. Then there's the scene where Cheese angrily storms off at the co-op meeting after Joe publicly says Cheese will stick to his own territories in a dispute between him and Hungry Man. He's obviously unhappy with Joe here, and there is a close-up of Marlowe whose eyes follow Cheese as he storms out. He identifies Cheese as a weak link here in Joe's crew, who he could manipulate to get to Joe. Identify Cheese like he identifies Michael as a prospect many episodes ago. He grooms Cheese, essentially, by delivering Hungry Man to him. It's reminiscent of a scene in The Godfather where Don Corleone's son, Sonny, speaks out of turn during a business meeting with Virgil Sollozzo, and Sollozzo identifies Sonny as a link to get to the Corleones given his interest in Sollozzo's offer. Cheese is just a guy who could never see the big picture. He must have been a real source of frustration for Joe given his lack of growth, but it's not as if he can pop a cap in Cheese's ass and not hear about it come Thanksgiving. But Cheese's small-time mentality, deviousness, resentment for Joe, coupled with his lack of intelligence, is a dangerous combination. It reminds me of another Godfather character in Fredo Corleone who betrays his brother Fredo. Someone like that, incompetent, greedy and no vision, can always become a problem later on, which is one of the reasons Slim Charles shoots him. Maybe he was also jealous at the way Joe started to treat Marlowe like a protege, or the way he clearly had more esteem for Slim than Cheese. If anything, Joe represents the old ways and Cheese is a manifestation of the new. He's honourless and has a lack of loyalty, but it's coupled with his dangerous incompetence. Like he says, there ain't no back in the day, ain't no nostalgia to this shit here, which interestingly is the same philosophy as when Slim says, think about the old days, they the old days. Times do change, but Cheese was just far too immature to be a part of that change. Maybe Joe was getting soft in his old age. After all, he made a big mistake by getting Marlowe set up with the Greeks. But that doesn't mean Cheese is the man to move Eastside forward. So all in all, though Cheese definitely betrayed Joe for his own benefit, there was clearly a building resentment from Cheese towards Joe that was building. And perhaps Cheese saw Marlowe as his way out from under Joe, with Marlowe simultaneously seeing Cheese as a way to get to Proposition Joe. So what do you think of this? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.